Let's talk about the timeline specifically, because even here, the runway is more compressed than most people realize, and it's shifted meaningfully just in the last few weeks. Windows 10 reached its official end of life on October 14th, 2025. As of that date, Microsoft stopped issuing free security updates for the operating system that, at the time, was still running on the majority of the world's Windows machines. The Extended Security Update program exists as a bridge, and consumer pricing started at $30 for the first year. But here's a genuinely recent twist worth knowing about. Just weeks ago, Microsoft quietly extended free consumer ESU coverage through October 2027, an extra year nobody was originally promised, announced through a support page update rather than a keynote. That's real, and it matters. But it's also worth being clear-eyed about what it actually buys you. It's a security patch bridge, not a permanent solution, and it doesn't touch the account requirement question at all. It only delays when you have to make the decision, not whether you'll eventually have to make it. For the roughly 240 million or more PCs worldwide that can't meet Windows 11's hardware requirements, that bridges the whole ballgame. Those machines aren't failing. The hardware works fine. The operating system functions exactly as it always has. They're being deliberately moved out of the actively supported ecosystem to create upgrade pressure that now has a slightly longer fuse than originally announced, but the same eventual destination. For users who can run Windows 11, the account requirement sits waiting on the other side of that upgrade. For anyone purchasing new hardware today, there is no official consumer path to Windows 11 setup without a Microsoft account. You can still navigate around it with registry edits, with the domain join option on Pro editions, with careful timing during setup, but the average person doesn't know these methods exist, and Microsoft doesn't advertise them anywhere in the standard flow. The official, intended path leads directly to account creation. So the picture forming through 2026 and into 2027 isn't a single event with one hard switch flip date. It's a convergence, the tightening end of Windows 10's support runway on one side, and the increasingly hardened account requirements on Windows 11 on the other, arriving close enough together in practice that the effect on ordinary users ends up being the same either way. The realistic choice most people face becomes accept the account requirement or go looking for an alternative, and Microsoft is clearly counting on the overwhelming majority of people simply accepting it, the same way most people accept whatever a setup wizard defaults to. Now let's look at the technical architecture more carefully, because this is where the risk stops being theoretical and becomes genuinely concrete. When you sign into Windows 11 with a Microsoft account, several things happen that simply do not happen with a local account. Your encryption keys, if BitLocker or device encryption is enabled, get backed up to your Microsoft account by default. That means a copy of the key protecting all of your local data now lives on Microsoft servers. The stated purpose is recovery. Forget your PIN or lose access to your device, and you can recover your data through your account. The unstated implication is that anyone with access to your Microsoft account, whether through phishing, credential stuffing, or a legally compelled disclosure request, also gains access to your encryption keys by extension. Microsoft authenticates your device against its Entra identity infrastructure even on consumer accounts. Your device generates a certificate, registers with Microsoft's identity servers, and that registration is precisely what enables seamless sign-in across devices. But if Microsoft's servers are unavailable, or your account gets suspended, or Microsoft's own systems flag your account as potentially compromised and lock it pending review, you can genuinely find yourself locked out of your own physical machine while that review plays out. This isn't a hypothetical scenario dreamed up for dramatic effect. Microsoft's own account recovery process has documented backlogs, and users across Microsoft's community forums and Reddit regularly report being locked out for days, sometimes weeks, while waiting for verification to complete. With a local account, none of this applies. Your credentials live entirely on your machine. The machine itself is the authority. You can be offline indefinitely, lose internet access permanently, and your computer keeps working exactly as it did the day before. There's a specific attack surface expansion here that's received almost no mainstream coverage, and it deserves attention. When your Windows session is tied to a Microsoft account, your sign-in credentials become a target not just for someone with physical access to your machine, but for attacks against Microsoft's own authentication infrastructure, and against you personally as a credential holder. The threat model expands from someone needs physical access to your machine to imagine sitting down at the computer you've owned for years and being told you cannot log in. Not because of a virus, not because you forgot your password, because Microsoft decided quietly in the background that your machine needed to verify your identity against a cloud service, and your internet connection happened to be down at that exact moment. No local fallback appears on the screen. No manual override unless you already know exactly where to look. Most people don't. That moment, one a growing. Number of users are already living through isn't a bug, It's a policy, and understanding what it actually means architecturally requires looking past the marketing language and into the structural decisions Microsoft has been making since 2021. This isn't a story about inconvenience. It's a story about ownership, about who actually controls the device sitting on your desk, and about a transition that's accelerating toward a set of deadlines most Windows users don't know exist. Let's start with what Microsoft has actually announced, stated plainly, because the framing matters enormously. In 2025, Microsoft confirmed that Windows 11 Home and Windows 11 Pro will require a Microsoft account for setup and for ongoing use going forward. Local accounts, the kind that have existed since Windows began, the kind that store your credentials on your own machine and require no external verification at all, are being systematically phased out of the standard setup experience. The workarounds that circulated widely in 2022 and 2023, disconnecting your network cable, entering a fake email address, have been progressively patched one by one, and the pattern has continued right into this year. Microsoft formally removed the OOBE bypass NRO command script from Windows 11's setup process earlier this year, framing the changes necessary to enhance security and user experience. As of the current 26.2 builds rolling out this summer, the underlying registry value that the script used to set is still technically functional, meaning a workaround still exists as of today, but reporting from earlier this year indicates Microsoft is expected to close that specific door too, likely sometime in 2027. Each patch closes one specific path. None of them change the direction the company is walking in. The trajectory is unmistakable. What begins as a requirement during setup doesn't stop there. Microsoft has already tied multiple core features, including OneDrive synchronization, the Microsoft Store, Windows Backup, and Copilot integration directly to account authentication. The direction internal product roadmaps have pointed toward since 2023 is a system where periodic online verification becomes a prerequisite not just for setup, but for ongoing session authentication itself, where your ability to use the computer you purchased depends at some level on the continuous goodwill of a cloud service. Before you dismiss that as an exaggeration, consider what Microsoft has already built and deployed with Windows 365 Cloud PC and its Entra Conditional Access model, formerly known as Azure Active Directory. Those are enterprise products today, but enterprise architecture has historically previewed consumer architecture in Microsoft's own roadmap by roughly 18 to 24 months. The infrastructure already exists. The only open question is how aggressively and how quickly it gets applied to the machine on your own desk. Here's what most of the conversation around this topic misses entirely. The account requirement is not primarily about security, even though Microsoft consistently markets it that way. Phrases like enhanced protection and identity-linked encryption appear throughout official communications. But look at the actual technical architecture underneath those phrases and what the Microsoft account requirement accomplishes. For Microsoft is something meaningfully different from what it accomplishes for you. It creates a persistent, stable identity layer that links your device telemetry, your application usage patterns, your search history, your Bing queries, your Edge browsing behavior, your Microsoft 365 activity, and your Xbox data into a single unified profile. A profile that simply cannot be constructed when you're operating on a local account. A local account user is, from Microsoft's data perspective, effectively a ghost. This is the part nobody frames clearly enough. The account lockdown isn't a security feature that happens to require your email address. It's a data use. That same centralization that makes daily use feel seamless is exactly what makes a single credential failure catastrophic. And that's exactly the architecture we need to look at more closely next. Let's talk about what Microsoft has specifically been building in the background for this transition, because the account requirement is only one visible piece of a much larger architectural shift underway. Microsoft has been steadily expanding what it calls Entra ID, the modern name for what used to be Azure Active Directory, into consumer account management. Entra ID is fundamentally an enterprise identity platform. It handles authentication, conditional access, device compliance policies, and identity governance for businesses running thousands of employee accounts. Microsoft is now building consumer account infrastructure on top of that same underlying platform, which means the same conditional access logic that lets a corporate IT department block a device from reaching company resources when it falls out of compliance is, architecturally, the same logic that could in principle eventually be applied to consumer accounts too. The word compliance is the important one here. In an enterprise context, compliance means meeting the security standards the company's own IT department sets. In a consumer context, as Microsoft's account infrastructure continues to mature, compliance could eventually mean meeting standards Microsoft itself sets unilaterally. There's already a visible shadow of this in Windows 11's hardware requirements. TPM 2.0, secure boot, and a supported processor are framed publicly as security requirements, but they also function as a compliance perimeter. Machines that don't meet them are, by definition, non-compliant, and non-compliant machines simply stop receiving updates. Extend that same logic forward, and the underlying architecture supports a future where a machine running software Microsoft hasn't approved, or one that hasn't checked in with Microsoft servers recently, or one whose linked account has triggered some internal policy flag, could be restricted in ways that remain completely invisible to the user until the moment they actually run into the restriction. That's not speculation about some distant hypothetical future. It's a description of infrastructure Microsoft is actively deploying and expanding right now. Here's where the argument builds toward something larger, and it's worth following the logic carefully rather than treating each piece in isolation. The account requirement, the ongoing telemetry architecture, the recall screenshot database, OneDrive's default backup behavior, and the expanding Entra-based consumer identity infrastructure are not separate, unrelated features, sitting side by side. They're components of one unified platform strategy. And the platform isn't really Windows. The platform is you, specifically your attention, your data, your habits, your history, your preferences, and your vulnerabilities as a consumer. Windows is simply the delivery mechanism. What's actually being built is a profile of every person using the operating system, rich enough to support targeted advertising, AI model training, and enterprise data services simultaneously. This direction has been visible since Windows 10 first introduced mandatory telemetry and Microsoft account integration back in 2015, but the pace has accelerated sharply over the last 3 years, driven by two converging pressures. First, the AI investment. Microsoft has committed enormous capital to building AI into essentially every surface of its products. And AI systems require training data at scale, which requires usage signals from real users across the entire installed base. Second, the advertising business. Microsoft's advertising revenue has grown significantly as the company integrates Bing, Edge, and Windows into one connected advertising surface, and account-linked identity makes that entire surface dramatically more valuable to advertisers. Viewed through that lens, the account lockdown looks less like a pure security decision and more like a revenue decision dressed carefully in the language of security. That's not a cynical leap. It's the interpretation most consistent with the actual evidence sitting in front of us. Now let's talk about recall specifically, because even if you never actively use it, the underlying infrastructure for it already exists inside your operating system if your hardware supports it. The feature was made opt-in following the intense security research backlash it received when Microsoft first unveiled it, and it remains opt-in on capable hardware today. But opt-in defaults can and do change with future updates. And the underlying screenshot capture service architecture still exists on qualifying hardware regardless of the toggle's current position. If you have Copilot plus PC hardware capable of running recall at all, go to Settings, Privacy and Security, Recall and Snapshots, and confirm the setting explicitly rather than assuming it's off by default. Independent security research tracking. Recall's rollout in detail has documented that even in its revised opt-in form, the database structure storing index screenshot data sits in a location accessible to other applications running under your own user account. Encryption protects it against offline attacks on a stolen device, but doesn't protect against malicious software running with your own credentials, which describes essentially every application you open normally in the course of a day. If malware ever reaches your active user session, that database is reachable without needing elevated privileges at all. There's also a regulatory dimension to all of this that's still developing, but will likely matter a great deal by the time the fuller architecture is in place. European data protection regulators have been examining Microsoft's telemetry practices since at least 2022, following a report commissioned by the Dutch government's Data Protection Authority that found Windows 10's telemetry in violation of GDPR in several specific respects. Microsoft adjusted certain data practices specifically for the European market in response, though the underlying architecture wasn't fundamentally restructured. The UK's Information Commissioner's Office has separately opened its own inquiry specifically into recall, and German state data protection authorities, historically among the most aggressive in pursuing Microsoft compliance issues, have issued guidance recommending against Windows in certain government contexts entirely. The account requirement intersects with these regulatory concerns in a very specific way. When your ability to use an operating system requires creating an account with a company subject to U.S. law, including the Cloud Act, which allows U.S. law enforcement to compel disclosure of data held by U.S. companies, regardless of where that data is physically stored. You're making a legal exposure decision whether you consciously realize it or not. So given everything we've just walked through, what can you actually do about any of this, realistically, depending on how much technical comfort you have? That's exactly where we're headed next. Let's talk about what you can actually do and how much of it you can realistically accomplish, depending on your comfort level, with a bit of technical fiddling. Start by understanding your current exposure. If you're running Windows 11 and signed in with a Microsoft account during setup, your device telemetry, your encryption key backup, and your usage data are already linked to that account right now, the first remediation step is going to Settings, Accounts, and checking whether you can convert your sign-in to a local account instead. On Windows 11 Pro, this remains genuinely possible as of this month through Settings, Accounts, Your Info, sign in with a local account instead. On Windows 11 Home, the option technically exists, but is harder to find, and Microsoft periodically adjusts how prominently or how buried it appears in the menu structure. If you're setting up a brand new Windows 11 machine and want to avoid the account requirement during the out-of-box experience, methods still exist as of this summer's builds, though Microsoft continues tightening them incrementally, and you should expect them to keep changing. Microsoft formally removed the bypass NRO command script from the setup process earlier this year, closing off the version most guides had relied on for the past couple of years. But as of the current 26H2 builds, the underlying registry value the script used to configure is still functional. During setup, pressing Shift and F10 together opens a command prompt, and from there you can manually set that registry value and reboot to restore the local account option. Reporting from earlier this year suggests Microsoft intends to close even that specific registry path sometime in 2027, so treat this as a narrowing window, not a permanent guarantee. Windows 11 Pro also still offers a domain join instead option during setup, which remains a reliable way to reach a local account without the registry route at all. These aren't elegant solutions. They're workarounds for a process deliberately engineered to route you toward account creation. These changes reduce optional data collection meaningfully, but they don't eliminate the required baseline underneath them, and you should go in understanding that up front rather than being surprised by it later. On the encryption key question specifically, if you have BitLocker or device encryption enabled and you're signed into a Microsoft account, your recovery key has almost certainly already been uploaded to that account. You can verify this directly at account.microsoft.com under Devices. If the key is sitting there, you have two real choices. Delete it from your account and store it locally or in a password manager instead, accepting that losing your own local copy means losing your recovery path entirely, or accept the cloud backup as is, understanding exactly what that implies. What you shouldn't do is remain unaware of which state you're actually in right now. For users seriously evaluating whether to stay on Windows at all, the honest assessment is that real alternatives exist, but each comes with genuine trade-offs worth weighing carefully rather than treating as an obvious slam dunk in either direction. macOS remains the most seamless alternative for people who can afford Apple hardware or are due for a refresh anyway. Apple also requires an Apple ID for many features and does collect its own telemetry, but the underlying data, architecture, and advertising business model are structured differently, and Apple has taken a more consistently adversarial posture toward third-party tracking that extends, to some real degree, into how it handles its own first-party data too. It isn't a perfect privacy solution by any measure, but the ownership model for your local device stays more intact. Linux, specifically distributions like Linux Mint, Fedora, or Ubuntu, represents the most genuinely minimal option available. The compatibility limitations are real and worth being upfront about. Certain professional creative software, some games, and specific corporate applications still don't run natively, but compatibility layers, particularly Valve's Proton project, have dramatically improved the gaming picture over the past few years, with thousands of titles now independently verified as working well on Linux. For someone whose daily computing centers on a browser, document editing, communication, and media, the day-to-day experience is now genuinely viable without significant friction. Let's be precise about exactly where things actually stand this month, because accuracy matters far more here than alarm for its own sake. Windows 11 currently still allows local account creation through workarounds across editions, though those workarounds keep getting harder to find and are explicitly expected to narrow further into 2027. Microsoft has not announced a mandatory online verification requirement for ongoing sessions. Once you're already logged in, meaning a local account, once established, keeps working without requiring continuous cloud authentication as of today. What has changed definitively is the default experience. The default is an online account, with Cloud Key backup enabled, with telemetry running at minimum required levels, with OneDrive sync turned on, with recall present and available on qualifying hardware. The defaults are designed to be accepted without examination, not scrutinized, and most people accept them exactly as intended, which is the actual mechanism by which this entire architecture keeps expanding one Windows release at a time. There's a philosophical point worth naming directly as we close this out, because the technical details ultimately connect to something bigger. Computing has historically been organized around a principle of user sovereignty. The machine runs what you tell it to run, your data sits where you put it, your authentication is held by you alone. That's not merely a nostalgic preference. It's a foundational condition for using a computer as a genuinely private tool for creative work, for anything you'd rather not have observed and quietly cataloged somewhere. Microsoft's decisions here are entirely rational from a business standpoint. Some of the stated interests, the security ones specifically, are genuinely aligned with yours. But the combination of account-linked identity, ongoing telemetry, recall, default cloud sync, and intra-based authentication creates a system whose defining characteristic isn't really security. It's legibility. Your computing life becomes visible to Microsoft in a way it simply wasn't when your machine was just a machine. So here's what I want to leave you with. Go check right now whether your own Windows 11 machine is signed in with a Microsoft